Some houses hide secrets that were never meant to be discovered. In a luxurious mansion in the heart of New York, a young maid begins to notice something strange, something no one else seems to question. Why does the millionaire's daughter never leave the house? Why is her existence whispered about, but never fully acknowledged? And why does her father, the powerful and enigmatic Richard Montgomery, seem so desperately protective? The answers lie behind locked doors, buried under years of deception, hidden in the past that no one dares to remember. But when the truth finally comes to light, nothing will ever be the same again. Stay until the end to uncover the shocking revelation, and don't forget to subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The first time Emily Carter stepped foot inside the Montgomery estate, she felt it. It was not the grandeur of the towering ceilings or the polished marble floors that left an impression, nor the expensive paintings that hung on every wall. It was something else, an unshakable feeling that something was off. The silence in that house was too perfect, too controlled, as if every whisper, every step, every breath was monitored. There was an eerie stillness, like the place had secrets buried deep within its walls, waiting to be uncovered. Emily had been hired as a maid, her job simple: clean, organize, and stay out of the family's way. The Montgomerys were old money, their name woven into the fabric of the city's elite. Richard Montgomery, the head of the household, was a man of few words but commanding presence. His wife, Margaret, had an air of quiet sadness about her, always impeccably dressed but seemingly lost in thought. Then there was Nathan, their eldest son, a businessman who rarely visited, and Eleanor, the daughter no one spoke about. That was the first strange thing Emily noticed. There were signs of Eleanor's existence: portraits in the hallways, untouched books in the library with her initials embossed in gold. But no one ever mentioned her. She never appeared for meals, never walked the halls. When Emily asked another maid about her, the woman simply shook her head. "She doesn't leave her room," she whispered before walking away quickly, as if even speaking of Eleanor was forbidden. One evening, as Emily dusted the shelves in the library, she overheard a conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery. Their voices were hushed, urgent. "We can't keep this up forever," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard's reply was firm. "We have no choice. As long as no one asks questions, everything stays as it is." Emily froze, heart pounding. Were they talking about Eleanor? She forced herself to keep moving, pretending not to have heard. But the words clung to her mind long after the conversation ended. That night, as she made her way down the hall, she noticed something strange. The third floor was completely dark, as it always was. It was the only part of the house Emily had been told not to enter, though no reason had ever been given. But as she passed by, she swore she heard something. A faint melody, soft and haunting. It was coming from behind one of the locked doors. A chill ran down her spine. Who was playing music at this hour? She hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. The sound was delicate, almost like a lullaby. She placed her hand on the doorknob, half expecting it to be locked, but to her surprise, it turned. The door creaked open slightly, revealing only darkness beyond. But before she could take a step inside, a voice behind her made her jump. "What are you doing?" Emily spun around to find Mrs. Montgomery standing there, her expression unreadable. The hallway's dim lighting cast shadows on her face, making her look even more fragile than usual. I heard music," Emily stammered. Margaret's gaze shifted to the door. For a brief second, something flickered in her eyes. Fear, maybe sorrow. But then, in a quiet voice, she said, "You must have imagined it." Emily wanted to argue, to insist that she had heard it, but something in Mrs. Montgomery's face silenced her. Without another word, Margaret reached for the door, closed it gently, and locked it. Then, she turned and walked away, leaving Emily standing in the dim hallway, her heart racing. That night, sleep did not come easily. Emily lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day. There was something deeply wrong in that house, something no one was willing to talk about. and she couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor Montgomery was at the center of it. The next morning, Emily decided to investigate further. She started small, asking the older staff members carefully worded questions. Most brushed her off, their responses vague and unhelpful. "She's unwell," one of the cooks finally muttered under her breath. Best not to ask too many questions. Unwell. It was a word that carried weight, yet revealed nothing. Determined, Emily began to pay closer attention to the movements within the house. She noticed that fresh meals were always taken up to the third floor, but never brought back down. Clean linens were left at the door, but no one ever saw them being retrieved. And then, one afternoon, as she was dusting the banister, she caught something. Just a glimpse. A shadow moving behind one of the curtains on the third floor. Someone was there, watching. Emily's breath hitched. For the first time, she saw proof that Eleanor Montgomery was not just a rumor, not just a forgotten presence in that house. She was real, and she was trapped. But why? As she stood there, staring up at the darkened windows, a chill spread through her. There was more to the story, more than anyone was willing to say. And no matter what it took, she was going to find out the truth. That night, as she lay in bed, she made up her mind. She would get closer. She would listen more carefully, watch more closely. And if there was even the slightest chance that Eleanor needed help, Emily was going to make sure she got it. But what she didn't know was that the secrets buried in that house were far darker than she could have ever imagined. And once she started uncovering them, there would be no turning back. The morning air inside the Montgomery mansion was heavy with the scent of polished wood and fresh linen. But to Emily, it felt suffocating. She moved through the house as usual, careful not to draw attention to the questions swirling inside her mind. Something inside her told her that the more she dug, the more dangerous this would become. But how could she stop now? There was a girl hidden in this house, locked away like a secret no one wanted to acknowledge. And that meant there had to be a reason. As she dusted the staircase railing, her eyes flicked toward the third floor, where the mysterious music had played the night before. The door she had nearly stepped through was now firmly locked again, as if nothing had ever happened. But something had happened, and Mrs. Montgomery had been so quick to shut it down. Too quick. "Emily, would you bring fresh tea to the study?" The voice of Mrs. Walker, the house's longtime head of staff, startled her from her thoughts. "Of course," Emily said quickly, composing herself. She moved toward the kitchen, where she prepared a tray with precision. As she arranged the porcelain teapot and delicate china cups, she thought about the staff's reluctance to talk about Eleanor. It wasn't just secrecy, it was fear. But why? She carried the tray carefully, walking toward the study where Richard Montgomery spent most of his days. The door was slightly ajar, and before knocking, she heard voices inside. She hesitated, but only for a second. "You need to get a handle on this, Richard," a deep male voice said. It wasn't one she recognized. A guest? A business partner? "Do you think I don't know that?" Mr. Montgomery's voice was sharp. She was never supposed to know. None of them were. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself against the door, gripping the tray tightly. "You can't hide it forever," the man continued. "One way or another, she's going to find out." Mr. Montgomery exhaled sharply. "Not if I can help it." Emily knocked before she could think better of it, pretending she had heard nothing. She walked in, her expression neutral, though her heart pounded so violently she feared it would echo in the room. Mr. Montgomery sat behind his large mahogany desk, his face composed, but there was tension in his posture. Across from him sat a man in an expensive navy blue suit, his expression unreadable. "Your tea, sir," Emily said politely, setting the tray down. Mr. Montgomery nodded, already distracted. "Thank you. That will be all." Emily lingered a second longer than necessary, hoping to catch one last piece of their conversation, but the room remained silent. As she turned to leave, she met the stranger's gaze. His eyes were sharp, studying her as if trying to assess how much she had heard. She quickly lowered her head and exited. Back in the hallway, her mind raced. They had been talking about Eleanor. She was sure of it. She was never supposed to know. What did that mean? And why was Mr. Montgomery so desperate to keep it hidden? That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece everything together. The more she learned, the more questions arose. She thought about Eleanor, locked away on the 3rd floor, hidden from the world. What kind of life was that? And did she even know why she was being kept there? Determined, Emily got out of bed. If she couldn't sleep, she might as well use the time wisely. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and quietly slipped out of her room. The mansion was silent, bathed in the dim glow of the moonlight spilling through the tall windows. She moved carefully, her steps light against the wooden floors. As she approached the 3rd floor, her heart pounded. She had no plan, only an overwhelming need to see Eleanor, to know she was real. Then she saw it. The door. The same door where she had heard the music before. But this time there was something different. A slip of paper had been pushed through the gap beneath it, barely visible in the darkness. Emily hesitated before bending down and picking it up. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. There, written in delicate, looping handwriting, were 4 simple words. "Do you see me?" A shiver ran through her. Eleanor knew she was there. Emily's fingers tightened around the slip of paper, her breath catching in her throat. The ink was slightly smudged, as if whoever had written it had hesitated before slipping it under the door. The words, "Do you see me?" echoed in her mind, unsettling her more than she cared to admit. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, her heart pounding against her ribs, before finally forcing herself to move. If Eleanor had left this note, it meant she knew Emily had been watching, that she had been listening. But more than that, it meant that Eleanor wanted to be seen. Emily crouched down and, after a moment's hesitation, slid the note back under the door. But this time, she wrote something in return. With shaky fingers, she scribbled a single word. Yes. She didn't wait to see if there would be an immediate response. She had lingered too long already, and the last thing she needed was to get caught lurking outside a locked door in the middle of the night. Forcing herself to walk away, she moved swiftly and silently down the corridor, retracing her steps back to her small quarters near the servants' wing. But sleep did not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those words staring back at her. "Do you see me?" Why would Eleanor write that? It was such a strange way to reach out, so deliberate yet so filled with uncertainty. Had she been locked away for so long that she questioned whether anyone even noticed her? Or was there something deeper, something Emily had yet to understand? By the time dawn crept through her window, Emily had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let this go. She had to find a way to talk to Eleanor properly. Not through notes slipped under doors, not through whispers of a house too afraid to acknowledge her existence. She needed to see her, to hear her voice, to understand what was happening in this house. She moved through the morning routine with a quiet determination, keeping a close eye on the movements of the staff. She had started to notice patterns, the way the housekeeper, Mrs. Walker, always brought fresh linens upstairs at exactly 10 o'clock, the way the breakfast trays were sent up but never brought back down, the way Richard Montgomery always avoided even looking in the direction of the 3rd floor. It was as if they had all trained themselves not to acknowledge what was right in front of them. As Emily dusted the bookshelves in the library, she listened carefully. The Montgomerys were gathered in the next room, discussing something in hushed tones. "This is getting out of hand." Margaret Montgomery's voice was tight with worry. "She's asking questions again." Emily froze. Richard's reply was measured, but there was an edge of frustration in his tone. "She wouldn't be asking questions if we had handled this properly from the beginning." "You mean if you had handled it?" Margaret snapped. "I told you this wouldn't work forever." There was a long pause before Richard exhaled sharply. "I'll take care of it." Emily quickly turned away from the door before she was caught eavesdropping. She wasn't sure who they were talking about, Eleanor or perhaps even herself, but something in her gut told her she was getting dangerously close to something they didn't want her to know. That evening, she took her chance. She waited until the household had settled into its usual rhythm, until she was sure she wouldn't be interrupted. Then, Heart pounding, she made her way back to the third floor. The hallway was eerily quiet, and for a moment, she hesitated. But then she saw it, the same slip of paper, now with a new message. "Come back at midnight." Emily's pulse quickened. She didn't know what she had expected, but certainly not this. She traced the letters with her fingertips, as if trying to find meaning in the way they had been written. Eleanor wanted to see her. She wanted to talk. Emily stepped away quickly, stuffing the note into her pocket. The rest of the night passed in agonizing slowness, every ticking second dragging on as she waited for midnight to come. She finished her work, stayed out of sight, and ignored the sinking feeling in her stomach that told her she was walking into something much bigger than herself. Finally, as the clock struck 12, she moved. The mansion was asleep, wrapped in a thick, oppressive silence. Emily moved carefully, each step measured as she made her way back up the winding staircase toward the forbidden floor. The hallway was cloaked in darkness, the only light coming from the moon spilling through the tall windows. The door was unlocked. She had expected it to still be bolted shut, had even braced herself for the possibility that she'd have to knock. But no, it was as if Eleanor had been waiting for this. Emily's hand trembled as she pushed it open. The room beyond was dimly lit, a single lamp casting a warm, golden glow against the wallpaper. And there, standing near the window, was Eleanor Montgomery. She was real. She wasn't some phantom of the house, some long-forgotten figure erased from the family's memory. She was here, flesh and blood, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her pale hands clasped in front of her. She looked at Emily with wide, cautious eyes, as if unsure whether to believe she had really come. "You came," Eleanor whispered. Emily swallowed hard. "You asked me to." Eleanor's lips parted slightly, as if she had expected Emily to ignore her note, to pretend none of this was happening. She took a small step forward, hesitating only for a second before saying, "I don't know who I am." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" Eleanor glanced away, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her nightgown. "They never tell me anything. I don't remember anything before this house. I don't know why I'm here, why I can't leave. I only know what they let me know." A heavy silence settled between them. Emily's heart ached at the raw desperation in Eleanor's voice. This was a girl who had been kept in the dark for so long that she no longer even trusted her own memories. "You have to help me," Eleanor pleaded. "I need to know the truth." Emily took a slow, steady breath. "I will," she promised. And in that moment, she knew there was no turning back. Emily had always considered herself level-headed, but standing in Eleanor Montgomery's room, she felt the world tilting beneath her feet. Everything about this moment felt surreal. The way Eleanor stood before her, fragile and hesitant, as if she were uncertain of her own existence. The room itself was beautiful but suffocating, as though it had been frozen in time. Heavy velvet curtains covered the windows, blocking out the outside world, and the furniture, though elegant, seemed barely touched. It was as if Eleanor lived in a perfectly maintained museum, a place where nothing ever changed, where time stood still. Eleanor watched Emily closely, as if waiting for her to speak first. Her deep brown eyes flickered with emotions too complex to name. Hope, fear, curiosity, and something else Emily couldn't quite place. "You said you don't remember anything before this house," Emily finally said, keeping her voice soft. "Nothing at all?" Eleanor hesitated, then shook her head. "Just flashes. Sometimes I have these moments, like when I hear certain sounds or smell something familiar. It's like a memory is right there, but I can't hold on to it." Emily frowned, her mind racing. This wasn't normal. No one just forgot their entire past without a reason. Someone had taken those memories from Eleanor, whether through control, manipulation, or something else. "Your parents?" Emily asked carefully. "Have they ever explained why you can't leave?" Eleanor let out a bitter laugh, a sound so hollow it made Emily's chest ache. "My father only says it's for my own good. My mother barely speaks to me anymore. She used to, but lately, it's like she's afraid." "Afraid of what?" Eleanor hesitated again, then lowered her voice. "Afraid of me." A chill ran down Emily's spine. She searched Eleanor's face for any sign of malice, but there was none. Only sadness, loneliness, a deep, aching isolation that made Emily's throat tighten. "That doesn't make any sense," Emily whispered. "You haven't done anything." Eleanor gave her a look that was almost apologetic. "Maybe I did. Maybe I just don't remember." The weight of those words settled between them like a heavy fog. Emily felt an overwhelming sense of urgency. Eleanor needed answers, but more than that, she needed someone to believe in her. A sudden noise in the hallway made them both freeze. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving closer. Eleanor's eyes widened, and she reached for Emily's wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "You have to go," she whispered urgently. Emily barely had time to react before Eleanor was ushering her toward a side door, one that blended so seamlessly into the wall that Emily hadn't even noticed it before. She slipped through just as the main door to Eleanor's room creaked open. Heart pounding, Emily pressed herself against the hidden door, listening. "Eleanor." A voice called softly. It was Margaret Montgomery. Emily could hear Eleanor shifting, her voice carefully controlled. "Yes, Mother?" A pause. "Were you talking to someone just now?" Eleanor hesitated, and Emily held her breath. "No," Eleanor finally said, her voice light, casual. "I was just talking to myself." Another pause. Then Margaret sighed. "You should be sleeping. You know how your father feels about unnecessary distractions." Emily could almost hear Eleanor's heartbeat, mirroring her own. "Of course," Eleanor murmured. The door creaked again, followed by retreating footsteps. Emily waited until she was certain the hallway was empty before slipping back out, her hands still trembling. Eleanor let out a shaky breath. "That was close." Emily nodded, her pulse still racing. "I need to go before someone sees me," she whispered. "But I'll come back. I promise." Eleanor met her gaze, something unreadable in her expression. "Be careful, Emily. My father. He knows more than he lets on." Emily swallowed hard. She already knew that, but she had the feeling she was only beginning to understand just how deep Richard Montgomery's secrets truly ran. Emily could still feel Eleanor's fingers wrapped around her wrist long after she had slipped back into the servants' quarters. Her heart was pounding so violently she was certain someone would hear it. She pressed herself against the wooden door, her breath uneven, replaying every second of the last few minutes in her mind. Margaret Montgomery had almost caught them. The thought made Emily's stomach twist. If she had been discovered in Eleanor's room, she had no doubt she would have been dismissed immediately. Maybe worse. There was something in this house, something unspoken and deeply wrong, and she had no idea how much danger she was putting herself in. She sat on the edge of her small cot, running a hand over her face. Sleep was impossible now. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Eleanor's expression. The way her eyes flickered with a desperate hope, the way her voice wavered with uncertainty. "I don't know who I am." The words clung to Emily's thoughts like a ghost. How could someone not know who they were? What could make a girl so completely disconnected from herself? Emily knew one thing. She couldn't stop now. She had to help Eleanor, even if it meant risking everything. The next morning, the Montgomery household was as quiet and orderly as ever. The staff moved efficiently, the air thick with routine, but Emily felt like she was seeing everything differently. She was no longer just a maid cleaning a house. She was a witness to something hidden, something the Montgomerys did not want the world to see. As she polished the long mahogany dining table, she noticed Richard Montgomery sitting in his usual seat at the head, a newspaper in his hands. His face was unreadable, his posture rigid. Margaret sat across from him, stirring her tea absently, her eyes unfocused. "You're distracted," Richard said after a long silence. Margaret barely looked up. "I'm fine." Richard set the paper down and studied her. "You're worried about her again, aren't you?" Margaret's spoon clinked against the porcelain cup. "How can I not be?" Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "Margaret, we've talked about this. She's safe. We've made sure of it." Margaret let out a soft, humorless laugh. Safe? Is that what we're calling this now? Emily focused on her task, pretending not to listen, but every word made her grip tighten on the cloth in her hands. We did what we had to do, Richard said firmly. We've given her everything. Margaret finally looked up, her eyes filled with something Emily couldn't quite place. Grief, perhaps. Regret. Accept the truth. Richard's jaw tightened. That is not up for discussion. A heavy silence filled the room. Emily swallowed hard. Whatever truth they were keeping from Eleanor, it was tearing Margaret apart. Later that afternoon, as Emily carried a fresh set of linens upstairs, she hesitated outside Eleanor's door. The note from the night before was gone, and the door remained shut. Had Eleanor been punished for their meeting? Emily knocked softly. There was no answer. She hesitated, then slowly pushed the door open. The room was empty. Her heart clenched as she stepped inside. The air was thick with stillness, the kind that only came when a place had been untouched for hours. The curtains were drawn tightly shut, allowing only a sliver of light to seep through. Emily's gaze swept over the space, searching for anything. Any sign that Eleanor was still here, that she was okay. That was when she noticed it. A journal. It lay on the desk, slightly open, as if Eleanor had been writing but had left in a hurry. Emily hesitated only a second before stepping closer, her pulse quickening. She knew she shouldn't, but she had to. Her fingers brushed against the worn leather cover as she flipped to the last page. The handwriting was neat, delicate, and the words sent a chill through her entire body. I had another dream last night. A hospital. A room filled with strangers. A woman's voice telling me everything would be okay. But I don't know her. I don't know any of them. Why do I keep seeing these things? Why do I feel like they're real? Emily's breath caught. A hospital? A woman's voice? These weren't just dreams. They were memories. Before she could read further, a sound from the hallway made her snap the journal shut. Footsteps. Her stomach twisted. She hurriedly placed the journal back where she found it and slipped toward the door, opening it just enough to peek outside. Nathan Montgomery was walking down the hall. Emily's pulse quickened. Unlike his father, Nathan had always been more of a mystery. He rarely visited, but when he did, he moved through the house like an outsider, someone who didn't quite belong. But this time, he wasn't just passing through. He stopped in front of Eleanor's door. Emily pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath. Nathan stood there for a long moment, his hand hovering near the doorknob as if debating whether to go in. Then, finally, he sighed and turned away, running a hand through his hair. As he walked off, Emily let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Why had he hesitated? Why hadn't he gone inside? There were too many questions, too many pieces that didn't fit. But now she had something new. Eleanor's dreams weren't just dreams. They were a key to the past. And Emily was going to find out what they meant. Emily barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, Eleanor's journal entries replayed in her mind. A hospital. Strangers. A voice telling her everything would be okay. They weren't just fragments of dreams. They were pieces of something real, memories that had been buried so deeply that Eleanor could no longer tell the difference between imagination and truth. Something had happened to her. Something that her family didn't want her to remember. Emily lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint ticking of the old clock down the hall. Outside, the Montgomery estate was cloaked in darkness. But inside, Emily could feel the weight of secrets pressing down on every wall. She knew she should be careful, knew that asking too many questions could cost her the job, or worse. But she couldn't ignore this anymore. Eleanor needed to know the truth. By the time the sun began to rise, Emily had already made up her mind. She dressed quickly, tying her apron neatly around her waist before slipping out of her small quarters. The house was quiet, most of the staff still asleep, and she used the opportunity to move freely, her steps light as she made her way toward the study. If anyone had answers, it was Richard Montgomery. His office was always locked. Always. But that morning, as Emily approached, she saw something unusual. The door was slightly open. She hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. The room smelled of leather and old books, of expensive whiskey and freshly polished wood. A large mahogany desk sat in the center, its surface meticulously organized, and behind it, a wall of bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling. The curtains were drawn, allowing only the soft morning light to filter through. Emily moved carefully, her fingers skimming over the desk as she scanned the documents scattered across it. Most were business-related, stock reports and legal contracts, nothing unusual. But then, folder, thick, marked confidential. Her heartbeat quickened. She knew she shouldn't, knew that if she got caught, there would be no way to explain herself. But she couldn't walk away now. She opened it. Inside were medical records. Her eyes darted across the page, taking in the words, her breath catching in her throat. The name at the top sent a chill down her spine. Eleanor Montgomery, her medical history, her treatments, and then a date, a decade-old hospital admission form. Emily's blood ran cold. Eleanor had been hospitalized, and not just once. The records went back years, detailing tests, evaluations, psychological assessments. But why? What had happened to her? She flipped to the next page and nearly dropped the folder. A name she didn't recognize. Biological mother, Julia Thompson. Emily's heart stopped. This wasn't possible. Eleanor's mother was Margaret Montgomery. That was a fact. She had seen them together, had watched the way Margaret looked at Eleanor with quiet sadness. But the papers said otherwise. Biological mother. What did that mean? A noise in the hallway sent a jolt of panic through Emily. She barely had time to shove the papers back into the folder and return it to its place before the door creaked open. Emily? She turned sharply, her stomach twisting. Nathan Montgomery stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. She forced a smile, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. "Mr. Montgomery," she said quickly, "I was just looking for something?" His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. She shook her head. "Just cleaning." Nathan didn't move. He leaned against the doorframe, studying her, his gaze sharp and knowing. "You're asking too many questions," he said finally. Emily's throat went dry. Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "If you're smart, you'll stop." She hesitated, trying to steady her breathing. "And if I don't?" For a moment, he didn't answer. Then finally, he exhaled. "Then you'll find out the truth," he said quietly. "But I'm not sure you'll like it." Emily held his gaze, refusing to back down. She had come too far to stop now. That night, she returned to Eleanor's room. The moment she stepped inside, Eleanor's eyes met hers, filled with a quiet desperation. "You found something," Eleanor whispered. Emily hesitated. "Are you sure you want to know?" Eleanor's hands trembled at her sides. "I have to." Emily took a deep breath, her heart hammering. "Eleanor, Margaret Montgomery is not your mother." Silence. For a moment, Eleanor didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, slowly, she shook her head. "That's not true," she said, her voice barely audible. Emily swallowed hard. "I saw the records." Eleanor stepped back, as if the words had physically struck her. "No," she whispered. "She raised me." She raised you," Emily said gently. "But she didn't give birth to you." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. "Then who did?" Emily hesitated. "Julia Thompson," she said finally. Eleanor's breath hitched. The name meant nothing to her. "Who is she?" Eleanor whispered. Emily shook her head. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." Eleanor sat motionless, her breathing shallow, her hands clenched into trembling fists at her sides. The name, Julia Thompson, rang in her mind like an unfamiliar melody, foreign and distant, yet carrying a weight she couldn't quite comprehend. The room around her felt suddenly too small, the air too thick, the walls pressing in as if they, too, held secrets she wasn't meant to know. Emily remained still, watching Eleanor carefully, unsure of what to say next. She had expected a reaction. Tears, maybe anger. But what she saw instead was something far more unsettling. Eleanor looked lost, as if the foundation of her entire life had just crumbled beneath her feet. "I don't understand," Eleanor finally whispered, her voice fragile. "She's my mother. Margaret Montgomery is my mother." Emily swallowed hard. "She raised you, Eleanor, but biologically, she's not." Eleanor shook her head, as if refusing to accept the words. "That doesn't make sense. Why would they lie to me? Why would she—" She stopped mid-sentence, a horrible realization dawning in her eyes. Emily could see it, the way Eleanor's mind was racing, putting the pieces together in real time. The hospital records, the strange way Margaret always looked at her, the sadness in her eyes, the way she rarely spoke about the past, the way Richard Montgomery controlled everything so tightly, ensuring no questions were ever asked. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "They stole me." The words sent a chill through Emily's spine. She hadn't wanted to believe it, hadn't wanted to jump to conclusions. But now, standing here in the dim glow of Eleanor's room, it was the only thing that made sense. Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest as if trying to steady her racing heart. "Who is she? Julia Thompson? Why don't I remember her?" Emily exhaled slowly, her mind still reeling. "I don't know, but we can find out." For the first time since Emily had started uncovering the truth, Eleanor looked afraid, genuinely afraid. "And if I don't want to?" Emily hesitated. She hadn't considered that possibility. "Do you?" Eleanor didn't answer. She only wrapped her arms around herself, her fingers digging into her skin, as if she were trying to hold herself together. Emily's gaze softened. "We don't have to do anything right now, but I need you to know that whatever we find, whatever the truth is, you're not alone in this." Eleanor met her eyes, and for a brief moment, something in her expression cracked. A deep, aching vulnerability that made Emily's throat tighten. She nodded just once. Emily took that as enough. The next morning, the Montgomery estate was eerily quiet. Emily moved through the halls with calculated ease, keeping her head down, listening more than speaking. Something had changed. She could feel it. There was a tension in the air, a silent electricity humming beneath the surface. Richard Montgomery was on edge. She caught glimpses of him in passing, standing at the window in his study, speaking in hushed tones on the phone, his movements sharp, controlled. It was clear that something was weighing on him, something urgent. Emily had a sickening feeling she knew exactly what it was. By noon, her suspicion was confirmed. Mrs. Walker, the head of the household staff, pulled her aside while she was folding linens in the laundry room. The older woman rarely spoke to her unless it was about work. But today, there was something different in her eyes. "Whatever you're doing," Mrs. Walker said, her voice low. "Stop." Emily stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." Mrs. Walker's gaze sharpened. "Don't insult my intelligence, girl. You've been poking around where you shouldn't." Emily's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm just doing my job." Mrs. Walker's lips pressed into a thin line. "If you believe that, then you're a fool." Emily swallowed. Why does everyone act like Eleanor is some kind of secret? Like she's not even real? Mrs. Walker's face darkened. Because some secrets were never meant to be uncovered. Emily hesitated, searching the woman's expression. "You know, don't you?" For a moment, Mrs. Walker didn't speak. Then, finally, she sighed, looking suddenly much older than before. "I've been in this house for 20 years, she murmured. "I've seen things, I've heard things, and I've learned, the hard way, that some truths are best left buried." Emily's hands curled into fists. She deserves to know. Mrs. Walker's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Emily saw something close to sympathy there. Maybe she does, but are you prepared for what happens next? Emily opened her mouth, but no words came out, because she wasn't sure. That night, she met Eleanor again. They sat together on Eleanor's bed, their voices hushed, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting warm shadows on the walls. Eleanor had been quiet for most of the day, lost in thought, but now, as she turned to face Emily, her eyes were steady. "I want to find her," Eleanor said. Julia Thompson. I want to know who she is. Emily studied her carefully. Are you sure? Eleanor nodded. I need to. Emily exhaled slowly. Then we will. But neither of them could have prepared for what they were about to uncover. The weight of Eleanor's decision settled between them like an unspoken promise. She wanted to find Julia Thompson. She wanted to know the truth. And for the first time since Emily had arrived at the Montgomery estate, Eleanor looked less like a fragile girl trapped in a gilded cage and more like someone determined to break free. But where did they even start? Emily spent the following day carefully maneuvering around the house, keeping her ears open, watching Richard Montgomery's every move. She knew he was hiding something. His tension was undeniable, his phone calls more frequent, his gaze sharper whenever he looked at Eleanor. He knew something was shifting. He could feel it just like Emily could. The first step was finding out who Julia Thompson was. The name had been in the hospital records, but there had been no address, no indication of where she was now. And Emily had a sinking feeling that if Richard Montgomery had gone to such great lengths to keep Eleanor's past hidden, Julia had likely disappeared. She needed help. That night, she snuck into the study again. The door was locked this time, but Emily had anticipated that. She had swiped the spare key from Mrs. Walker's set earlier that day, her fingers steady despite the risk. Now, standing in the dimly lit hallway, she slipped the key into the lock and turned it. The room was exactly as she had left it. Neat, controlled, as if Richard Montgomery ensured that no trace of disorder ever lingered. But Emily was no longer interested in the surface. She moved quickly, scanning the bookshelves, the drawers, searching for anything that might lead her to Julia. Then she saw it. A filing cabinet. Locked. Her heart pounded. She didn't have the key for this one, but she had come prepared. Pulling a thin metal hairpin from her pocket, she bent it slightly and inserted it into the lock. Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to stay calm, to focus. She had never done this before, had never even attempted to pick a lock, but she had seen it done. Couldn't be that hard, right? A minute passed, then another, then a soft click. Emily barely breathed as she opened the drawer. Folders, dozens of them, each labeled with names she didn't recognize. But she wasn't looking for them. She was looking for one name, and then Thompson, Julia. Emily's stomach twisted as she pulled the file from the drawer, her hands clammy. The folder was thinner than she expected. She opened it, scanning the contents quickly. A birth certificate, a medical history, and then, at the bottom of the folder, an address. Emily's breath hitched. She had found her. The realization sent a wave of exhilaration through her, followed almost immediately by fear. If she had found Julia's address here, it meant Richard Montgomery had known where she was all along, which meant he had chosen to keep Eleanor from her. Emily barely had time to process this before the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Panic surged through her. She shoved the folder back into the drawer, locking it as quickly as she could, her heart racing. She slipped out of the study just as the footsteps grew louder, her pulse hammering in her ears. She didn't stop moving until she was safely back in her room, the slip of paper with the address clenched tightly in her fist. Now she had a name, a location. The next step was getting Eleanor out of the house, and that, she knew, would be the hardest part. The following evening, Emily met Eleanor in her room once again. Eleanor had been restless all day, pacing, chewing her nails, her usual composure fraying at the edges. When Emily slipped inside, she turned to her with wide, expectant eyes. "Did you find anything?" Emily exhaled. "I found her address." Eleanor's lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't truly expected Emily to succeed. She stepped forward, hesitantly, as if the slip of paper in Emily's hands held the power to undo everything she had ever known. "Where is she?" Eleanor whispered. Emily handed her the paper. "She's in Boston." Eleanor stared at the address, her fingers trembling. "She's alive." Emily nodded. "Yes." A single tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eleanor inhaled sharply, wiping her tears away. "I have to go." Emily had expected this, but hearing Eleanor say it out loud made her stomach clench. "Eleanor, if your father finds out." "I don't care," Eleanor said fiercely. "I can't stay here. Not now. Not knowing this." Emily knew she was right. Eleanor would never be free unless she left. But Richard Montgomery would never let her. "How do we get you out?" Emily asked. Eleanor hesitated, thinking. "There's a gate at the back of the estate," she murmured. "It's locked, but the key is in my father's office." Emily's stomach twisted. "You want me to go back in there?" Eleanor met her gaze, her eyes filled with desperation. "It's the only way." Emily exhaled slowly. She had already risked so much. What was one more time? That night, she moved carefully through the darkened house, her breath shallow as she crept toward the study once again. She had only seconds to get in and out. She reached the desk, her fingers ghosting over the surface before she found what she was looking for. A ring of keys neatly organized. Her pulse quickened. She grabbed them, tucking them into her pocket before slipping back into the hall. And then, a voice. "Going somewhere?" Emily froze. Richard Montgomery stood at the end of the hallway, his face unreadable. A slow, cold terror crept through her veins. He knew. Emily's body went rigid, her breath catching in her throat. Richard Montgomery stood at the end of the hallway, his tall frame bathed in the dim glow of the single-wall sconce flickering beside him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, bore into her with an intensity that sent a chill through her spine. She had been caught. Her mind raced, grasping for an excuse, anything that would make sense. But she knew. He knew. There was no use pretending. "Going somewhere?" His voice was calm. Too calm. Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep her hands at her sides, to keep her voice steady. "I was just... Spare me the lie," he interrupted smoothly, taking a slow step forward. The floorboards groaned under his weight, the sound eerily loud in the silence. "You've been sneaking around my house, asking questions you shouldn't be asking. And now, here you are, rummaging through my office in the middle of the night. Tell me, Emily." His head tilted slightly. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Her heart pounded so violently she could feel it in her fingertips. She had two options, lie or tell the truth. And something about the way he was watching her, the quiet calculation in his expression, told her that lying wouldn't work. So she didn't. "I'm helping Eleanor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She deserves to know the truth." Something flickered in Richard's gaze, a flash of something she couldn't quite place. Anger, regret, something else entirely. But it was gone before she could name it. "You think you know the truth?" he mused. Emily clenched her jaw. "I know enough." Richard sighed, rubbing his temple as if this were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "You have no idea what you're doing, do you?" His voice was almost disappointed. "You think you're helping her, but you're not. You're only making things worse." Emily's hands curled into fists. "She's not your prisoner. She has a right to leave." Richard's gaze darkened. "She has no such right." Emily's breath hitched. "What does that mean?" A heavy silence filled the space between them. For the first time, Richard looked almost tired. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly, as if debating whether to speak. Then, in a voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it, he said, "Eleanor is not who you think she is." The words sent a shiver down Emily's spine. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. Richard's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw it: fear. Not anger, not control. Fear. "If she leaves," he murmured, "everything falls apart." Emily shook her head. "You can't keep her locked up forever." Richard's jaw tightened. "I can, and I will." Emily's stomach twisted. She had thought this was about control, about power. But now, staring into Richard Montgomery's haunted eyes, she realized it was something else entirely. It was protection. But from what? A movement in the darkness caught her attention. A shadow shifting at the top of the stairs. Eleanor. She stood there, barefoot in her nightgown, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes wide as she took in the scene before her. She had heard everything. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, in a voice that trembled only slightly, Eleanor whispered, "Tell me." Richard didn't move. Eleanor took a step forward, then another, her bare feet soundless against the hardwood. "Tell me why you won't let me leave. Tell me why you're so afraid." Richard's face was unreadable, but his hands clenched at his sides. "Eleanor, tell me," she cried, her voice cracking. The silence that followed was deafening. Then finally, "You were never supposed to exist," Richard said. The words slammed into Eleanor like a physical blow. She staggered back, her breath hitching. "What?" Richard exhaled heavily, as if the weight of the truth was suffocating him. "You weren't supposed to be born, and when you were, we did what we had to do to keep you safe." Eleanor shook her head, her entire body trembling. "Safe from what?" Richard hesitated. Then, finally, he said, "From her." Emily's pulse quickened. "Her?" she echoed. "You mean Julia Thompson?" Richard flinched at the name, his expression darkening. "That woman is not who you think she is." Eleanor's voice broke. "She's my mother." Richard's jaw clenched. "She was a mistake." Eleanor gasped, stepping back as if the words had physically struck her. Richard pinched the bridge of his nose. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand," Eleanor cried, her voice raw with emotion. Another silence. Then finally, "Julia Thompson was part of an experiment," Richard admitted. "A project that should have never existed. A project that should have never created you." Eleanor's breath caught. Emily felt her own body freeze. Richard's eyes were hollow. "You weren't born, Eleanor. You were made." The room spun. Eleanor's lips parted, but no sound came out. Emily felt as if the floor had been ripped out from under her. "Maid?" She turned to Eleanor, watching the color drain from her face. The way her entire body seemed to shrink beneath the weight of those words. "You're lying?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. Richard's gaze softened. "I wish I were." Eleanor took another step back, shaking her head violently. "No," Richard sighed. "I didn't want this for you. I tried to protect you from it. But the truth is, you are the result of something that was never supposed to happen. And if you leave this house, if the wrong people find out," he exhaled sharply, "you won't survive it." A crushing silence. Eleanor looked down at her hands, as if expecting to see something different, something unnatural. "Then what am I?" Richard's voice was quiet. "You're my daughter." Eleanor let out a strangled sob. Emily's chest ached at the sound. But Richard wasn't finished. He turned to Emily, his expression unreadable. "And now that you know, you have a choice to make." Emily swallowed hard. "You can walk away," Richard said. "Forget everything. Leave Eleanor here where she's safe." He took a slow step forward, his voice steady. "Or you can take her out of this house, into a world that will rip her apart the second they learn what she is." Emily's breath caught. Eleanor was still trembling, still struggling to process what she had just learned. Emily turned to her, their eyes meeting. Eleanor was pleading, "Please don't leave me." Emily clenched her fists. Then, in a voice that was unwavering, she said, "We're leaving." Richard closed his eyes, and in that moment Emily knew everything was about to change. The night air was thick with tension, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on them as Eleanor and Emily stepped toward the open door. The estate behind them loomed in eerie silence, the place where Eleanor had lived her entire life, the place where she had been hidden away like a secret never meant to be discovered. But now she was leaving. She was stepping into the world for the first time. And yet, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that they were walking into something much bigger than they understood. Then, a voice cut through the silence. "Going somewhere?" Emily's blood ran cold. She turned slowly, heart hammering. Margaret Montgomery stood at the top of the staircase, her nightgown pooling around her feet, her face pale in the dim light. Unlike Richard, there was no anger in her expression, just quiet resignation. Eleanor stiffened beside Emily, her breath uneven. "Mother!" Margaret's lips parted slightly, something flickering in her gaze. "You were never supposed to know." Her voice was soft, almost mournful. "We wanted to protect you." Eleanor's hands curled into fists. "By locking me away?" Margaret swallowed hard. "By keeping you safe." Emily stepped forward, her voice firm. "Safe from what?" Margaret's eyes darkened, her shoulders stiffening. "From the truth." Eleanor let out a hollow laugh. "I don't even know what that means anymore." A heavy silence filled the room. Then, Richard's voice. "You should have never gone looking, Emily." Emily whipped around, her pulse spiking. Richard stood in the doorway to his study, his expression unreadable, his sharp eyes locked onto hers. "You don't know what you've done." Emily took a step back, instinct telling her to run. "I've done what you should have done a long time ago. I've told her the truth." Richard let out a slow, measured sigh. "You think you know the truth?" He shook his head. "You only know the parts of it that were meant to be found." Emily's stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" Richard didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Eleanor, his daughter, his mistake. "Eleanor," he said softly, "come inside, please." Eleanor's jaw clenched. "No." Something flashed across Richard's face. Not anger, not disappointment, fear. "Eleanor," Margaret whispered, "please." But Eleanor was already shaking her head, already stepping back. And then, Emily saw it. The way Richard's eyes flickered toward the nape of Eleanor's neck. The way Margaret's breath hitched. The way Eleanor suddenly reached up, as if sensing something was there. Something she had never noticed before. A cold chill crawled down Emily's spine. "Eleanor," she whispered. "Turn around." Eleanor frowned. "What?" "Turn around," Emily repeated, her voice hoarse. Eleanor hesitated, then slowly turned, her back facing Emily. Emily swallowed hard, stepping closer. Her hands trembled as she gently brushed Eleanor's hair aside. And then, she saw it. A small, intricate QR code tattooed at the base of Eleanor's neck. Emily's breath hitched, her heart pounding so violently it felt like it might stop altogether. "What is this?" she whispered, her fingers barely grazing the tattooed skin. Eleanor stiffened. "What are you talking about?" Emily turned to Richard, horror coursing through her veins. "What did you do to her?" Richard exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a brief moment, as if he had been dreading this very moment. "She was never supposed to find out." Eleanor's fingers flew to the back of her neck, her breathing sharp and uneven. "What is it?" she demanded. "What's on me?" Margaret let out a choked sob. "Oh God!" Eleanor spun around to face her mother, desperation clawing at her throat. "What is it?" Richard's voice was quiet, controlled. "It's the answer you were looking for." Eleanor's entire body trembled. "What does it mean?" Richard studied her for a long moment. Then finally, "It means," he murmured, "that you are not Eleanor Montgomery." The world tilted. Eleanor stumbled back, her chest tightening, her vision blurring. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not." Richard stepped forward. "Scan it." Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. She turned to Emily, her eyes wide, terrified, pleading. Emily hesitated, but then, slowly, she pulled her phone from her pocket. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold it steady. She raised it to the QR code and scanned. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a file popped up on the screen. Subject 346B. Emily's breath caught. She clicked it. A video began to play. The screen flickered, static at first, then an image appeared. A hospital room, white walls, medical equipment, and then a woman appeared on the screen. Julia Thompson. Eleanor gasped, her entire body trembling. "It's her." The woman in the video, her mother, looked directly into the camera, her dark eyes filled with something close to regret. "If you're seeing this," she said, her voice soft but firm, "it means they didn't tell you." Eleanor couldn't breathe. Julia took a slow breath. You are not who you think you are. You never were. They told you your name is Eleanor Montgomery. They told you Richard and Margaret are your parents. But that's a lie. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. Emily reached for her, gripping her arm, holding her up. You were created, Julia continued, not born. You were part of a project they shut down, a project they tried to erase. Eleanor let out a strangled sob. Richard Montgomery closed his eyes. Julia's voice wavered slightly. I loved you. I tried to stop them, but they took you from me. And now you have a choice. The video ended. Silence. Eleanor stared at the phone, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Everything had been a lie. Her name, her family, her existence. She turned to Richard, her eyes wild, shattered. What am I? Richard's voice was quiet. You're my daughter. Eleanor let out a broken laugh, tears spilling down her cheeks. No, I'm not. Richard's face remained unreadable. Then what are you going to do? Eleanor met his gaze, her lips trembling. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, she said, I'm going to find her. And with that, she turned and walked away. Emily followed without hesitation. Margaret let out a strangled sob. Richard Montgomery watched them go, his expression hollow. And as the front doors swung shut behind them, he let out a slow, heavy breath. The secret was out, and nothing would ever be the same again.